Good morning, Dan and Amy. A lot of people have had to begrudgingly admit that Trump's bluster may be at least partly responsible for bringing Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table. Potentially. There's a willingness on the part of President Trump. But that doesn't mean that everybody thinks it's a good idea. National Review's editorial board opined against such kind of willy-nilly meetings with Kim Jong-un, and the perspective on that will add to the perspective on that by having our next guest join us. He is Michael Rubin, resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute, author of a number of books, including Dancing with the Devil and Kurdistan Rising. Michael, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan.
So, your reaction to the possibility of a Trump-Kim Jong-un tete-a-tete?
Well, count me as one of those who are deeply skeptical. There used to be a time when Republicans especially would think twice about meeting with murderous dictators from rogue regimes, and they would criticize those who would want to reach out to, for example, countries like Cuba or countries like Iran. The important thing to remember about the North Koreans is that every single North Korean leader has reached out to U.S. presidents before asking for this sort of meeting. Even Jimmy Carter, while he himself was interested, his dovish aides, recognized that he was at risk of being played and therefore didn't want to meet. The same thing was true with Bill Clinton, who explored a meeting with Kim Jong-un's father and decided at the last minute not to do it.
But President Obama met with Putin. He's a murderous dictator. President Reagan sat across and negotiated arms treaties with Gorbachev against the evil empire. Why is this different?
Well, there's a difference between a normal adversary like the Soviet Union and a country that is, in all intents and purposes, like a rogue regime. The difference is that when you come to North Korea, they have never abided by any single agreement. An agreement is worth the paper it's written on, nothing more. And as soon as it's no longer in North Korea's interest, they don't hesitate to walk away. So it's like that old adage that's oftentimes attributed to, I believe it was Albert Einstein, insanity is doing the same action repeatedly but expecting different results each time. There was a 1992 denuclearization agreement with George H.W. Bush. That went nowhere. There was the 1994 agreed framework with Bill Clinton. That, too, went nowhere. And indeed, when you look at the whole scope of North Korea's nuclear weapons program, it happened against the backdrop of diplomacy with the West. And at some point, we need to sit back and wonder whether North Korea looks at diplomacy as a way to reach a win-win situation, or as an asymmetric warfare tactic in order to sort of tie the West's hands together while they advance with their programs with sanctions lifted.
Well, Michael, these are two unusual leaders who have a flair for drama, and it just seems like the ultimate reality TV show moment, if they do air this. But if nothing's accomplished, where do you go from there? Because
well, Amy, this is the big risk. Dan had brought up Putin or Ronald Reagan talking with Mikhail Gorbachev, but the thing is, when you look at Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, they got along, and it was their personal relationship which enabled the end of the Cold War. Now, when it comes to Vladimir Putin, when he met with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the two had the opposite reaction. They intensely disliked each other, and today we have Vladimir Putin threatening to nuke Florida. Now, the point of this is Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are both mercurial leaders. And if they don't hit it off, if this isn't Dennis Rodman diplomacy, then the situation could get much, much more tense very quickly.
But then so we just continue to apply sanctions and advance defensive missile systems in South Korea, and that's just going to be the strategy while North Korea attempts to nuclearize?
Well, the first thing you've got to do is ensure that if you do talk, that you don't relieve the pressure before you get the results from the talk. The second thing you need to do, Dan, is, and my colleague Nick Eberstadt, who has followed North Korea for decades, has pointed this out. When North Korea says talks without preconditions, what they don't mean is open talks. What they mean is actually lifting the preconditions imposed by previous agreements like the 1994 agreed framework. So if Donald Trump decides to sit down and talk without preconditions, in effect, he's giving North Korea its reward up front.
Well, that's a fair point. Let me turn to another topic and ask you about this new book that's coming out, not by conservatives, Michael Isikoff and David Corn. Apparently, David Corn has stopped harassing people long enough to contribute to this book. Former National Security Susan Rice issued a stand-down order to National Security Council officials developing aggressive options to respond to Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. This, again, according to a book that comes out this week from Michael Isikoff and David Corn, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. And there's a piece in Mother Jones where Corn was, or maybe still is, as well about this stand-down order issued by Susan Rice. If that's true, how should we process that?
Well, there's a lot of hypocrisy going around, and Washington, to be quite honest, is known for it. The fact of the matter is Hillary Clinton would have lost the election no matter what because she won a poor campaign. She never went to, for example, Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. That said, now that she did lose, the Democrats, rather than finding fault with their message, finding fault with the way they ran their campaign, are trying to come up with this notion that there was some great, deeper conspiracy. Now, no doubt, Russia did muck around with the election, and what their goal wasn't to elect Donald Trump. They didn't expect that to happen. My wife is a fluent Russian speaker, a native Russian speaker, and the Kremlin was flabbergasted when Donald Trump won. What they want is just to sort of tarnish the notion of American democracy. And what many people have been arguing is if Russian hackers want to muck about with the election, there's really not much you can do about it. So while I think Susan Rice is the utmost cynical opportunist and doesn't necessarily have an honest bone in her body, the fact of the matter is there's not much we could have done in response to the Russian hacking other than ensuring that, for example, campaign chairmen's passwords on their private email account wasn't simply password.
Yeah, but do you think President Trump is doing enough to stop them from meddling in the midterm elections or in 2020?
Well, let me put it this way. I do think that Donald Trump's policies towards Russia have been much more harsh and much more confrontational than the previous two presidents, President Obama and President Bush.
Well, and I just want to go back to this. It's one thing to say there's only so much we can do and recognize the limitations. It's another thing, if this account is accurate, to issue a stand-down order, right?
I agree with you on that, Dan, and that's a fair point, too. Certainly, we need to recognize that both Russia, Iran, increasingly China, they're adversaries of the United States. They don't look at diplomacy as, again, a win-win situation. They look at it as a zero-sum game, and the last thing we want to do is being caught playing checkers when everyone else is playing chess.
All right. He is Michael Rubin. He's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, author of a number of books, Dancing with the Devil, Kurdistan Rising, former Pentagon official. He knows of what he speaks. Michael Rubin, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
And you joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen.